contact with outside of, the family unit. And it's important for us, we really have an opportunity, if we understand trauma, we have an opportunity to really set a different kind of tone when we're working with our families. So to just jump right in, I want to start by talking about what is trauma, right? Because I think a lot of us have a perception about what trauma is. And it's easy for us to say, well, I haven't experienced trauma because we have this idea of it, or maybe other people haven't experienced trauma. So we want to explore what that is first and foremost, right? So the Oxford Languages Dictionary, right? The Oxford Dictionary describes trauma as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. No other qualifiers, right? If something is deeply distressing or disturbing to you, that could be considered trauma. Isn't always trauma, right? But it certainly could be, and that's the textbook definition. Simply put, trauma can be any experience that forces our brains and bodies to compensate in any way with what's coping at the moment, right? If I get up at night, right? I got some kiddos at home. If I get up at night and I'm walking to the bathroom and I step on a Lego, right? And my body, like I go into survival mode because I don't know, I've got trauma around, maybe I stepped on glass when I was younger, or it's a trigger for me. That can also be traumatic, right? Something as silly as stepping on a Lego, or, if you're having a really bad week, things just aren't going right. I had a really rough week a couple weeks ago, and like come Friday, I woke up, I was working, and I like broke my fingernail, right? And my week had been so horrible. I was like, look, that's the end, right? I kind of packed everything up, got back in bed, and that was a day. Like that moment was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? That can be trauma. Trauma is any experience that forces our brains and bodies to compensate, to go out of the norm, to go out of our character, to cope with what's going on in the moment. Trauma is not just the big things. We think of trauma, we think of huge, disastrous events, we think of things that are really extreme, but trauma is not always the big things. Sometimes trauma is those little t traumas that impact us on a personal level, but they're not what we typically associate with long-term trauma, right? Losing a pet, right? If a child loses a pet, maybe a pet goldfish, or, a gerbil, or even, a dog or a cat, that can be traumatic. We don't necessarily think of that. Having a fight with a friend and not knowing if you're going to be able to rectify that can be a trauma. Getting in a fight with your parents, right? And that uneasy feeling of like, are they going to forgive me? Are we going to be okay? Sometimes that can be trauma. So trauma is not just those extremely large things that happen. They're the things that happen to us every day that put stressors on the body, right? That make our brains have to compensate in different ways. And when we experience an abundance of trauma, our bodies can start to utilize those coping mechanisms. So, when you're having a really rough week, maybe you zone out, right? That's that fight, flight, or freeze, right? I'm going to zone out. I'm not going to, participate. Maybe I feel stuck, right? Those are trauma responses. And when we encounter trauma for an extended period of time, whether it's primary trauma, because we're the ones that personally experience it, or whether it's because of secondary trauma, right? We encounter other people that have experienced trauma. Our bodies can start to develop those coping mechanisms at an automatic pace, right? So maybe at first I only go into fight, flight, or freeze when I'm in the middle of a traumatic situation or something that's really distressing for me, right? If I have enough of those distressing events, my brain will start having a trauma response sometimes when I'm perfectly fine, because it starts to get used to being in that mode of pumping out those additional chemicals that come when we are coping. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when we talk about how trauma impacts the brain, because there's actually a physiological response in the body where the brain says, oh, there's something going on, and it needs to release chemicals, hormones, endorphins, right, to regulate what's going on. So when we have trauma that we experienced at an extended period, our bodies can start to release those endorphins and act like we're in the middle of trauma even when we're not. Now, in the chat box, I want to ask you, and I'll wait just a few seconds. What are some examples of trauma, or maybe things that we don't necessarily think is trauma that you could think of that might be traumatic for people? Moving. Yep, absolutely. Having to go from one location to another. If you have a pet pass away, absolutely. Right. These are things that loss of a loved one, that's a huge one, and name misgendering. Yep, absolutely. Not respecting who people are. Right. That can definitely be a trauma. And so someone doesn't say hi back to you when you say hi, man, that's anxiety, right? You ever wave to somebody and they don't wave back to you? And you're like, did I do something wrong? Right. If you're that kind of person, losing a favorite blanket or toy for a child, losing my favorite water bottle, right? And so, like last night, one of our facilitators, she had left her water bottle here overnight. And she was like, man, I was like really missing my water bottle. She was like, I need to get it tonight. Like, we opened back up the office to get the water bottle and everything, right? These are things that we attach to. Losing them can definitely be a trauma. Loss of a job and income. Yep, absolutely. I do see a question that says, what, according to you, will be the impacts of COVID-19 on trauma-informed care? I will definitely try to touch on that. I think that the pandemic has really brought to light more that we are all experiencing trauma. So I'll make sure that I touch on the points today that I think cover that question. Listening to the traumas of other people, secondary and tertiary trauma is real, you guys. Losing your keys. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes positive changes can be trauma because it involves major change. Yes, in our kinship training classes, we talk about grieving around milestones, right? When children do things that are really exciting, graduate, go to another grade, from middle school to high school, they play JV, those are great things, but sometimes that can be a harsh reminder of like what's going on with us, right? So that can also be like traumatic, even though it's fun. Just when you ask my question, please mention my name. Okay, I absolutely will. I'll try to remember that. Losing a coworker, right? Getting robbed, right? All of these things are things that can be traumatic for us. Food insecurity, friendship fallouts. You guys got it. It's not just the big things. It can be, right? It can be things like natural disasters, becoming homeless, right? Going to war. That's when we started really examining trauma during Vietnam, death of a loved one. You guys have hit on a lot of these. Poverty, these are things that definitely can cause trauma to us that we don't always think about, right? We just think of like people are just going through life and, these are things that happen. Yeah, they are, but they're also traumatic for us. If I'm having a hard day where I'm having a fight with a friend, or, I've lost a coworker, or, I've gotten robbed, that's the one I see right here, right? I'm having a rough day. Other things might be more of a trigger for me than they normally would. So yeah, I'm just going through life, but sometimes life is hard and that can be trauma. Um, when we start to think about the way that trauma impacts us and impacts outcomes for us, this is when we start looking at adverse childhood experiences, right? When we start doing the research around what trauma impacts our outcomes, we know that adverse childhood experiences greatly impact us on a lifelong level, right? And so, what are those? What are things that have that kind of impact on us? Well, there's two categories. And again, I'm looking at traumas here, unplanned transitions. Dude, those are so unplanned change is really hard. So that's true. Being a parent who reunified and closed the case, anything coming up with the kids needing help brings the trauma. Yeah. If you've had trauma around having the kids removed or feeling like you were targeted for seeking out help, right? Then that's a trauma. Though all of those things are very real. So when we're looking at those adverse childhood experiences, the first place we typically look at is in the home, right? We look at what's going on at home because that is the majority of a child's environment, right? They spend a lot of time between home and school, and then other time out in the community or whatever the case may be. In the home, adverse childhood experiences can be things like divorce, violence against a parent, emotional abuse, right? Having a family member be incarcerated, maybe not just mom or dad, but maybe you have a cousin or an aunt or an uncle that you are really attached to. Someone having mental illness or, physical neglect, those things that we know as abuse or neglect, right? All of these things can be those adverse childhood experiences. And we know that the more of these somebody experiences, the more likely they are to have experienced trauma, to experience trauma responses, maybe even when they're in a safe place, and have that trauma impact their outcomes. But when we're looking at these childhood experiences, we can't just be limited to the home. There is a whole life that happens, especially as children get older, outside of the home. So adverse childhood experiences also encompass things like poor housing quality, right? Lack of affordable housing, poverty, community violence, things that, maybe we can't control as a family, lack of opportunity. The day that somebody realizes that sometimes your hard work is not enough, you might not have the funds available to do something you want to do, or the connections, right? No matter how hard you work, that can be a type of trauma. Being discriminated against, having your community disrupted for any reason. All of these things can be trauma. Lack of social capital. Over the pandemic, being isolated, especially if you're like a social butterfly kind of person, right? All of these things are trauma. And over the pandemic, we saw this getting worse because we took away people's outlets for dealing with trauma, and then we left them inside a very closed environment where things get stressful, right? No matter, you go on vacation, it's cool, it's fun. You come home, you feel like you need a vacation from your vacation, So when you're at home and you're just stuck in situations that may be stressful or ongoing, the pandemic has certainly heightened that. Right. And it does impact and change how we need to look at trauma and how we need to address that going forward. Can you relate to this? Right? All of these things that we've put up here, even if you say, I came from a great home, right? There was no problems in my house. That's not true. That's not realistic for most people. But, my house was perfect. If I could wave a magic wand, is there things to the community that you could relate to, right? When you look at the totality of what can constitute trauma, is it starting to become easier to see that this is really something that impacts all of us, not just our clients, not just our families that we're working with. This is probably something that all of us have experienced at one point or another. Now, in talking about what trauma is, right, we also want to talk about what trauma is not, because we want to be able to have real, authentic, genuine conversations about how to treat each other with the kind of kindness, compassion, mercy, understanding, right, that's required for trauma-informed engagements. And so talking about what trauma is not, right, I want to make sure to highlight that trauma is not necessarily abuse. A lot of people will say, and I've been doing this for a long time, right? And I've talked to a lot of people, and I hear a lot of people say, well, I grew up in a great family. My mom and dad loved me so much. They worked 2 jobs to take care of me. They never hit me. They had great discipline strategies. I had a great life. So I haven't experienced trauma. Not necessarily true, right? Going back to this slide right here, we know that trauma doesn't just happen in the house. And so sometimes we might be having trauma responses or things happening, and we even feel guilty about that because we don't feel like we've gone through anything that really qualifies as trauma. But as we saw on slide 1, the only qualifier for trauma is that something has to be deeply disturbing, distressing, right, or stressful on the body. That's it. Everything else is fair game, whether it happens at home, in the community, at school, at work. Anything else can be trauma. It's also important for us to remember this when we're working with kinship families, because a lot of times we will hear parents say, I didn't raise my kids like that. That's my brother and sister. I know we weren't raised like that. But I would challenge you to remember that there is no possible way that we can know every single experience that a person has. People are not around us 24 hours a day. My own children are not around me 24 hours a day, right? They're all at school right now. My son could have trauma at school, and that could be the trigger for him, right? Where his body starts having those trauma responses. Something could happen to him on the bus on the way home from school, or when he's out at a football game with his friends. There's no possible way for any of us to know every experience somebody's had. And there is no other qualifier for trauma except for it had to be really hard for us. That's it. So please, as you're working with families and even looking at yourself, because as I do this, part of my goal here is to help you see that you've probably experienced some trauma too, right? And that you're worthy of the same kindness, compassion, mercy, and understanding that I will encourage you today to give the families that you work with. So moving past that, I guess I'll ask you before I move into how trauma impacts us, does anybody have any questions about anything that I've discussed so far? If so, please feel free to put them in the chat. You guys see I'm looking at that as we go, so I'll make sure to address those. But as we move forward in this conversation of trauma, right, we've talked about what trauma is not, right? We want to start talking about how trauma impacts us. And how does it impact us, mind, body, spirit, right? In the work that we do, how does it impact our families? Like what does trauma have to do with the work that we do, right? So trauma impacts us on a variety of levels. The first one being socially, right? If I've experienced trauma, that is going to form and impact how I interact. It's going to, help impact whether I'm the life of the party or am I a wallflower, right? Not always, it's not the only qualifier, but, it might dictate whether I'm a binge drinker on the weekends or, whatever. Trauma impacts the way that we engage and operate in social situations. It also impacts us psychologically. In a little bit, I'm going to talk to you about how it impacts the brain and how it impacts us on a psychological level. Trauma can make us irritable. It can make us irrational. It can impact our ability to focus. It could impact our ability to retain information. And so on a psychological level, right, it can impact our ability to regulate rational thought. And so on a psychological level, there are a lot of impacts that trauma has on us. Behaviorally, right? If I start to embody my trauma responses, that's going to shape my behavior. Am I the kind of person that's very short with people? Do I cut people off a lot? I am the kind of person that does that because I get excited. It's not always trauma, but it can be, right? The way that we listen to people and engage with people, the way that we behave when we're under stress, right? The way that we behave when somebody surprises us with not great information. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, we need to talk. And you're like, okay. They're like, not right now. We'll talk later. What do you mean? We'll talk later. If you're like me all day long, I'm thinking about, what are we talking about? What's later? What, when is it coming? That's part of trauma shaping my behavior around that interaction, right? And my anxiety. Emotionally, right? If we start to see, when we start to talk about the physiological impacts of trauma, we will talk about, how it releases adrenaline and dopamine. These things impact our emotions. It impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, people pleasing, right? Behaviors. Yeah, we become people pleasers when trauma impacts our behaviors. Not always, right? Nothing is ever everything or nothing. Life is 1,000 shades of gray, but people pleasing can definitely be a sign of trauma impacting our behavior. Emotionally, right? How can we regulate emotion? What causes us stress, right? What gets our emotions going? What gets us, what gets our heart pumping? That all can be impacted by trauma. Biologically, there's an entire study around called epigenetics around how trauma impacts us at a cellular level, at a DNA, and in our DNA, right? How trauma actually changes the way that our body expresses and releases various chemicals in the body, and those changes can be passed down for generations. So trauma actually impacts us on a biological level. If I'm somebody who, when I have trauma, my body releases adrenaline, right? Adrenaline can cause anxiety. It can cause racing heart. It can cause, think about how you feel when you do something that's adrenaline pumping, right? If you've ever jumped out of a plane, Not me, but if you've done that or other things that get your heart going, you know, kind of that feeling of adrenaline, right? And hopefully those are good adrenaline inducing situations. But what about when it's not? You know, and that's, you know, that's that anxiety, that's that lack of rational thought. We can pass those chemical imbalances onto our future generations and impact us at a biological level. And it takes about 2 to 3 generations to work out those changes. Environmentally, right? Trauma can impact our environment. Am I a person that invites people to my house? Am I a closed off kind of person, right? Am I very private? Am I the kind of person that you got to call me before you come to my house? Spoiler alert, I am. You definitely have to call me before you come to my house. That's part of my trauma, right? I don't want people just showing up in my house. You know, and I'm sure you guys can relate to that, right? Trauma impacts us at that environmental level. Like even in my own house, in my room, right? There's been a point in time because of the trauma that I've went through, right? I was raised in foster care. I've worked, you know, as a child welfare professional for a long time. You know, primary and secondary trauma are real, right? In my room, when you go in my room, my fan is always set to high. I've got the blackout curtains, right? Because I need a very calming environment to help me decompress from the stress that I feel, and sometimes the overstimulation and the overwhelming feelings that I feel when working with trauma and having my trauma triggered, right? So it impacts my environment and the way I set up my living situation. Physically, in just a moment, I'm going to go through a whole slide about how trauma impacts us physically from head to toe. It literally it increases our blood pressure. It can cause migraines. It can cause, you know, gestational, you know, GI issues, all kinds of stuff. And so it has that impact on us as well. Sorry, you guys, I'm just looking at time. I'm trying to moderate myself today a little bit. So I was just looking at my slides to make sure I'm on time. But at a physical level, that trauma is very real for us. And we will touch on that just a little more in a moment. Finally, trauma impacts us intergenerationally, right? And when I was growing up, I grew up raised by friends of my mom's family, and they were old enough to be my grandparents. My mom would have me call them mama and papa, right? And they were raised at a time where they didn't recognize trauma. You know, they were very like sticks and stones, don't break your bones, but words could never hurt you. Now we know that verbal abuse is real, right? It has an impact on us. It would be like, you know, put your big girl pants on and you'll be all right. You know, PTSD isn't real, right? I remember sitting in a therapy session with my grandpa one time, my foster dad, because I'll refer to them both ways, so I guess I'll say that. And you know, the therapist was telling him that I probably had some PTSD from some of the stuff I went through. This is a guy who went through Vietnam, and he was like, "That's not real. Don't tell her that." You know, so we come from a generation and from families that don't even necessarily recognize trauma, but it's passed down to us intergenerationally. And so what the trauma that I experience today, and the way that I cope, and the way that I form my environment, and the way that I socially react to that, right? I pass all of that stuff down to my kids, including those biological changes that I was just telling you about. So trauma has a variety of impacts on us in our whole lives. So one thing where most of this comes from, right, and where I'm going to touch on now, is how trauma impacts the brain. You know, because I'm talking about behavioral, I'm talking about socially, right? I'm talking about our environment, but all of that stuff starts with the brain. And so next, I want to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts the brain in different ways. Okay. And how we can, you know, recognize that. So first, trauma causes physical brain changes. It literally changes the brain. Trauma can cause stunted brain growth, reduced brain cells, and damaged connections within the brain. So literally changing our brain chemistry. Secondly, we can experience impaired behavioral control, right? Trauma, I was telling you earlier that when we experience trauma, one thing that the brain does is it releases a variety of hormones and chemicals, right? Adrenaline, cortisol, you know, things like that. And that can cause us to have that impaired behavioral control. Adrenaline raises the heart rate. It causes us to not be able to focus or function. It causes illogical or irrational thoughts and behavior, right? It's almost like we're overdosing on adrenaline when we're having a trauma response. We're almost like overdosing on cortisol. These things are overflooding our bodies to help us cope with what's going on. These overdoses, for lack of a better term, of these chemicals cause these extreme reactions. It's traumatic in itself to be told something you're feeling is not valid. Absolutely. To be kind of shut down, have somebody, gaslight you. That's all can be traumatic. Trauma impairs emotional control, right? It makes us unable to process emotions, which can lead to mood disorders and things like that. It can cause us to have anxiety. It can contribute to PTSD, complex PTSD, all of those things. And then finally, we've got that impaired learning ability. I'm sure we can imagine if we can't even focus to regulate our behavior, it would definitely be hard to focus on processing new information. The release of these chemicals can cause educational fatigue, things like that. And so this can cause impaired learning ability. Additionally, trauma can impact our body, like I was telling you guys earlier, from head to toe. At the top, right? Starting just from the top down, trauma can impact us. It gives us headaches, right? That increase of adrenaline, that increase in cortisol, it literally causes headaches. It can cause memory loss. If you've ever done something that causes a lot of adrenaline, sometimes it feels like you're on autopilot, right? Like if you have jumped out of a plane before, a lot of people say like they're at the top, they remember that, then it's all a blur, right? And then all of a sudden they're at the bottom, but they know they had a great time, woo, but they don't really remember. It's just kind of a blur for them. That's adrenaline. When it happens in great circumstances, it's something like that. When it happens from trauma, it comes out as memory loss, and it's not great. There's no whoo after, but it still happens. Additionally, it can cause increased heart rate, right? That adrenaline causes your heart rate to increase. It causes cardiovascular disease, things like that. It can actually cause hypertension, high blood pressure. That's a very real and physical response to trauma, right? The release of those chemicals is very real. And so the way that those impact our body is also very real. Upset stomach and eating disorders. This can cause Crohn's disease. Well, I mean, not directly, but it can cause you to have a lot of eating issues that can cause things like Crohn's disease. It can cause just upset stomach. It can cause a lot of things within the body in the digestive tract. A lot of times when young people first come to our house, I hear from caregivers a lot. And I'm also a kinship caregiver, right? So even with my own child, they come and they're always hungry. And one thing I hear is like, my kiddos are always eating or they're hiding food, right? Well, adrenaline, and we tell people adrenaline being released in the body, cortisol being released in the body increases appetite. So when kiddos first come to our house, it's much better usually to plan out 5 smaller meals and snacks throughout the day than 3 large meals. It's great to have a basket of safe, nutrient dense, calorically, balanced foods, things like maybe watermelon, right? That have a high water content. That's not going to be a high calorie content, right? There's things we can do to help our kiddos, but upset stomach and eating disorders is a very real impact of trauma. Inflammation and cardiovascular disease, talking about why I said that up there with the increased heart rate, but inflammation is very real. Inflamed, joints, inflamed, having a lot of aches and pains, having, neck, tightness in the neck, tightness in the back. Those are all very real responses to that overflow of the adrenaline and those different hormones that are happening or that are being released. Restlessness, right? Feeling like you got a lot of energy. Kids already have a lot of energy, but when you add trauma and that cortisol and you add that adrenaline especially to it, it's 10 times worse. They have 10 times more energy. You have to give them more opportunities to get that out. Restless leg syndrome, right? And then finally, decreased lifespan. All of these things collectively, right? If you've got cardiovascular disease, you've got inflammation going on, you've got, just digestive issues going on. All of these things collectively can lead to a decreased lifespan. This is a very real, and these are very tangible physiological impacts of trauma on our bodies. So before I move forward, because next I'm going to talk about, hopefully at this point, you're kind of on board with me, right? You're like, yes, trauma is a real thing. We've probably all experienced something traumatic. I can kind of relate and see how these things, right, maybe are reflected in my kiddos and my families that I work with, maybe even with myself or other coworkers, right? And so is there any questions about this before, as I move forward? If there are, please put those in the chat box. But I want to ask you, right? Who has experienced trauma? Now that we have talked about all of the things that trauma is, what trauma is not, who would you say has experienced trauma? Raising all my hands, right? Yes, everybody, right? Everyone. Even if you came from even if you had like a model upbringing, which really isn't very realistic for most people, right? Everybody had something that happened. But even if we were raised with rainbows and unicorns, right? Most people have experienced trauma. Our clients, the families that we've worked with have experienced trauma. Leaving the womb can be a type of trauma, right? So it's important for us to remember that everybody has experienced trauma. The difference is not everybody has experienced a level of trauma that induces a non-controllable trauma response. Right? Have you ever, and I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this, especially if you have kiddos of your own, or you've been, a kinship caregiver or a foster parent, and you're talking to the kids and you're telling them what you need them to do, or maybe you're correcting some behavior, and it looks like they're just looking at you, right? Or looking even through you. They don't even acknowledge, or it doesn't even look like it registers that they're there, right? That's a trauma response. When you're talking to somebody and you like zone out, sometimes that can be a trauma response. And it's important for us to remember that, because we are all of us, from our coworkers to ourselves, to the families we work with, and most importantly, the children that we work with, we are all worthy of the kindness, compassion, mercy, and understanding that trauma-informed care and trust-based relational interventions requires. So how do we work with clients who have experienced trauma? If we're all on the same page and you're like, yeah, Trista, you've sold me, we all have trauma. Well, what do we do now? What do we do with that knowledge? That's what I want to kind of move into and talk with you next. So the first thing I would say is utilize trust-based relational interventions. TBRI is the application of trauma-informed principles, right? When I go out into the world, and maybe I go to the bank or the grocery store, and the cashier is not as polite or customer service focused as I would like her to be, right? Choosing to give that cashier the benefit of the doubt and say, you know what, maybe they're just having a hard day. Maybe they had stuff happen this morning that I don't know about. Instead of being like, you know what, that person stinks, I'm never going back to that store, they're not a good worker, right? Just that shift in perspective is utilizing a trust-based relational intervention. Anytime we approach people with consideration for what they might be going through, that's TBRI. So the first step in this, when we teach this in class, is mindfulness, right? And mindfulness starts with ourselves. It's making sure that we are in a good place, that our cups are full in a good way, that we are not triggered, that we are in a good place before we address anything that's going on with somebody else, right? If we are not our best selves, it is much easier for a situation to pull us out of character. So mindfulness and making sure that we woosah, maybe we, smell some, essential oils, or maybe we do pressure points, or maybe we have a breathing or meditation thing, just making sure we're our best selves. That is the first step of TBRI, because when we are mindful of where we are, it helps us to be mindful of where other people are as well. The next thing is empowerment, right? We want to empower the families that we work with, the children, our children, children that we work with, families, people that we encounter. We want to empower them to be their best selves. You know, if I have a child in my house that I know that's struggling with telling the truth right now, right? Maybe they're lying a lot. Maybe they had to lie at home to be safe, right? And I'm working with them on that. I'm not going to give them a lot of opportunities to lie to me, right? If they know they're not supposed to have food in the room, I'm not going to ask them. I see rappers in the room. Hey, did you eat in your room? And give them an opportunity to mess up and lie to me. I'm going to say, hey, I can see in your room you were probably eating in there. We need to clean it up, right? I'm not going to set my child up for failure. I'm going to, try to set them up for success. That is the second principle of TBRI. We can do this with birth parents. We can do this with caregivers. We can do this with caseworkers. We can, or, our coworkers, I mean, saying caseworkers, our coworkers. We can do this with the people on the phone for customer service, right? We can, we can utilize empowering strategies with people that we come across. And this is a trust-based relational intervention. Finally is connecting with people, right? We want to have relationships with people outside of this engagement where we need to maybe modify behavior, address, unacceptable behavior, or deal with the difficult things. We want to have built a rapport with those people first and foremost. When I'm dealing with my kids, or, if you've ever had a job, not the jobs you have now, because I know those are phenomenal, but think back to like maybe a job you had in college or in high school, right? Where maybe you had a boss that like the only time that boss showed themselves or came out or spoke to somebody is when there was a problem, right? When something wasn't going well. So then anytime you see that boss, you're like, oh, I know something bad's fixed to happen. Here they come, right? That's what they're known for. Well, if we only approach or make time to reach out to our families when something is wrong, right? Or to our children, to our coworkers, to whoever, then we become known as like that negative Nancy boss. And when people see us, they're like, oh, well, I know something's fixing to come, right? But when we take the time to connect with people outside of that and build rapport with them, then that rapport will buy us a lot with people. Rapport goes such a long way with people. With kids, let me tell you, I have at my house, I always have teenagers, and I typically have teenagers in my house that other people say like they're out of control, right? They're just those kids, right? And I got boys, we got like enough testosterone for several lifetimes at my house. But I can tell you, because I build rapport with them, I don't necessarily see some of the same issues other people see, and even when things start to get kind of crazy, because I got boys, I can bank off my rapport and I can crack a joke. I can, give a pat on the back. I can do something because I've already built connection to diffuse the situation. So connection, that is that third principle of TBRI. So what does that look like, right? All right, Trista, here's some principles. Thank you. These are great. What does that look like? Well, we want to offer acknowledgement and validation, right? Things are not easy. When we're engaging with families, it's not under the best of circumstances. People don't wake up in the morning and be like, ooh, I think I want to deal with the child welfare system today. Sounds like a great time, right? We approach families usually, or we get referred to families, or we make contact with families because things are not great. There is a need happening, and that we have to address. We want to acknowledge that. We want to validate that this is hard stuff. A lot of families will say, I interacted with the child welfare system and I felt like I was supposed to just go with the flow and be okay with everything that's happening. We shouldn't expect that of people. Letting people, acknowledging that this is hard stuff, acknowledging that they, might be going through some trauma, and validating, that this is not an easy path, that can go a long way with people. Having this front, like, we've got to be so okay with things all the time, or else we're not worthy or qualified to deal with them, that's not realistic. We really want to acknowledge and validate the experiences that people are having. And someone said earlier, that not acknowledging this, and not acknowledging where people are coming from can be another kind of trauma, right? So we definitely want to make sure we do this. I know there was the question earlier, I'm going to try to go back and remember. Shmuel, you were asking about like COVID, right? And I told you I was going to talk about that over time. When COVID comes, right? When we're talking about COVID, the same things that traumatized me might not be what traumatized you. I'm an introvert. The fact that I got to sit at home for a year and a half and work from home, it was not that bad for me, right? I actually was kind of happy with it. But for my children who were social butterflies, that isolation it was devastating, you know? So we have to, especially with COVID, not negate people's trauma, right? And not think, oh, well, that's just something petty. There's no way that can be traumatic. None of us can say what can be traumatic. I just told you guys at the beginning of the day, I had a bad week and I broke my fingernail and climbed back into bed, right? Thankfully, I didn't like go off the deep end, right? Thankfully for any of us, we're one traumatic response away from anything that could happen. So we just want to make sure we acknowledge and validate that for other people as well. Oops. Oh yeah. Acknowledge our assumptions. You know, we all have assumptions about people. I'm not going to ask you what your assumptions about people are, because we don't need to talk about those out loud. We just need to have really honest conversations with ourselves, right? For me, I will share, you know, growing up, there was a lot of yelling that happened around me. When people raise their voice, I automatically associate that with aggression, hostility, right? But I'm also from the South. In the South, let me tell you, people talk loud. We talk loud. Sometimes I even talk loud. Am I my own stereotype? You know, so we want to make sure that we acknowledge whatever our assumptions are. You know, everybody is not the same. Everybody was not raised the same. Everybody was not taught that the same things are healthy or unhealthy. So just take a real look at yourself about what assumptions do you have about people, and try to consciously work past those to see people for who they are and not who we assume they are. Right. This is a great way for us to be trauma informed and really treat people with the kindness and compassion that they deserve. Take time to dig deeper. You know, if you work for the department somewhere, for the child welfare system, if you're an investigator or something, when you show up to people's houses, parents may not act like they want to, you know, participate. Or even, you know, in other cases where, you know, a kinship navigator program, you know, but we hear all the time, bio parents don't want to participate in services. They don't want to do this. They're not doing this. We assume it's because they'd rather be partying, or because they'd rather be doing something else, or because, you know, whatever the case may be. We don't necessarily know that that's true, though. People might be really embarrassed to ask for help. You know, it's much easier to say, forget all of this. This is stupid. The process is stupid. I don't want to participate, than it is to say, all of you guys seem to know how to do this a lot better than me, and I've got no idea what to do. Right? That is not, you know, that's not always the case. And we just want to remember that for people. You know, remember that parents are already feeling judged. I don't care what's going on. You could have like the best scenario where parents, they called the department, right? They called and they're asking for help. You're still feeling real judged. You know, to have to ask somebody to come help you with your kids, like, we're supposed to be able to take care of our kids. That is a societal norm that we have set. So when people can't do that, that's really embarrassing. Then we have kinship situations where we took the kiddos from the parents, placed them with family. Excellent, right? Please don't take anything I've said as not being in favor of that. But then we ask bio parents to go to family dinners, maybe go to holiday dinners, go to family reunions, go to whatever the family is doing. They got to watch their kids walk in with somebody else. They got to watch somebody else tell their kids what to do while they're there. They got to watch their kids leave with somebody else. That is a very embarrassing, judgmental situation, you know? And so we just want to take that into consideration for people. Don't immediately write them off as uncooperative. You know, we're doing a great disservice when we do that, and we're not really getting to the heart of what might be going on. So next question, right? How do we work with clients? Oops, let me go back. No, I don't want to tell you guys the answer already. Let me go back. How do we work with clients when we are experiencing the impact of trauma, right? How do we work with clients when we have that? Because trauma is real for everybody. You know, as a parent, when I discipline my children or I think about consequences in my house, right? I got to think about my own trauma. I just told you guys a little while ago, yelling is a trauma trigger for me. What do I do when my own kids are yelling and they're triggering me? Right? I have to put some thought into that. When we go out and work with clients, when we work with coworkers, when we see these situations, it's not realistic for us to think that A, that secondary trauma isn't real, and B, that our trauma from the past may not be triggered. I'm not going to stop working usually, right? Unless it's really extreme, but we have to think about how we're going to deal with this. Step one, utilize TBRI on yourself. You, my friends, are just as worthy of kindness, compassion, mercy, and understanding as everybody else that you work with. You need that as well. You need to be your best self in order to help other people be their best selves. Be mindful. Take a moment. Think about what your triggers are. You know, when you're working with families, if yelling is a trigger of yours, you know, in family, you know, you're encountering a family that's doing a lot of yelling, you don't have to be like super weak and vulnerable, but you can be like, hey, you know, when you raise your voice, it becomes hard for me to communicate. You know, we can make ourselves like real people to people, even in hard situations, right? That's how we build that connection and that rapport. It's okay to say, hey, the way you're communicating with me is really hard. Can we, you know, I know this is hard for you, it's hard for me too, you know? And at first they might be like, who cares about you, right? You're here doing something to me. But if we are consistent, we will shape the way that people interact and deal with us. I actually do a whole class on that too. Maybe you guys can join me for that one day. The second one is empowering, right? We want to empower ourselves, make sure we are getting enough sleep, make sure that that we're empowered. We are getting enough rest. We are getting enough sleep. We're getting nutritionally what we need. We're taking time to decompress, right? That we are having a good support network. You know, I deal with a lot of confidential things. I can't necessarily share everything that I deal with my support system, but I can share how it makes me feel. I can share, hey, I went through something today that is super triggering for me, right? I can utilize my support system like that. That's empowering. And then connection, I can build connection with people who are important to me to help me stay more grounded, and also with my clients, my coworkers, right? When we personify ourselves to one another, it's harder for people to treat us unkind. You know, I used to do call center work for a very long time, and it is like proven, evidence proven, that people will be more hostile, aggressive, they'll curse more, whatever, over the phone because they don't have to look at you face to face. When you build rapport with people and you connect with them, it is much harder for them to treat you in a way that is unkind. So you're less likely to have your traumas triggered. You want to make sure that you're utilizing TBRI all the way around the board, on your clients, on your coworkers. I use it on my kids, right? I use it with everybody. I give people the benefit of the doubt. You know, it's not only better for the way that I treat them, but it's also better for my mental, right? If I walk around thinking that everybody has bad intentions, it's very stressful for me. But if I walk around giving people of the benefit of the doubt, they will also be more likely to give me the benefit of the doubt, which I really need most of the time, right? And it will be less stressful for me. It is much easier for me to think of somebody as just being a failing person with good intentions than it is for me to believe that somebody has bad intentions for us. So this is really important. Utilize TBRI on yourself. Next, think about self-care, right? Self-care is imperative. You guys might have crazy caseloads. You might be working buku overtime. You know, we're in grant season all the time, right? So you might be super stressed, super worked out. Take time for self-care. We just went through slides about how trauma impacts the brain and the body. That's not just for our clients. There's no qualifiers on that, right? It's not like, well, if the child welfare system gets involved, then you'll have these, you know, responses to the trauma. No, if you have trauma, that stuff could happen. So make sure that you're finding ways to engage in self-care, even if it's just, you know, 15 minutes in your room staring at the wall so that you can decompress. I've done that more than once, speaking from personal experience. But just find ways to care for yourself a little bit, love on yourself, buy your favorite candy bar every once in a while, grab yourself that Starbucks, maybe not every day, if you feel, but make sure that you're treating yourself with that kindness and compassion. Self-realization, right? Self-actualization. Be really real with yourself about what your trauma is, about what your triggers are, about, what all of the things are that make you who you are. We just talked about a little while ago a variety of ways that trauma shapes our lives, right? Socially, behaviorally, environmentally, all of these things. Have a real one-on-one with yourself and have some real honest dialogue about where you are at in all of that. What kind of things are impacting you? And then also take some time to think about, what are you really good at? The trauma that we experience, yeah, it does sometimes give us other things, right? Anxiety sometimes, or things that we feel like aren't necessarily great attributes for ourselves, right? I don't think I'd go around like bragging that I have anxiety, right? Whoo, look at me, right? But my trauma has also made me very resilient. It's also made me perform well under pressure. It's also made me somebody who can articulate over a lifetime of experiences this kind of stuff to you guys, right? So when I'm looking at self-realization and self-actualization, I don't want to just look at, the challenges. I don't want to look at the way that trauma has maybe negatively impacted me. I also want to look at what benefits it's brought, and I want to capitalize on those. And I want to take those strengths, and I want to integrate them more into the things I do every day. And I want to take a real honest stock of all of that, my challenges, my strengths, my triggers, my trauma, so that I can deal with myself accordingly. And I can deal with myself in a way that is that kind, caring, compassionate, TBRI focused way of dealing with it, right? Be intentional about not letting our biases, triggers, and traumas interfere with our work. It is very easy to assume that because we were raised a certain way, or because certain things meant something in our own homes, that it's like that everywhere. Try to fight that urge. For one, I'm going to tell you two things. Don't feel guilty about it. I said that, when you encounter people, your experiences shape the way you see them. That is true for most people, if not all people. Don't feel guilty about it. Just know it and own it. And then once you own it, be intentional about working against it, right? I don't want to approach a home, maybe when I come to the door of a house, I hear the mom yelling at the kids inside, so I automatically assume this is a hostile, aggressive mama. But then when I listen, they're joking around, they're playing. Or maybe, as I get to know the mom, I realize maybe she's deaf in one ear, or maybe something else is going on, right? I want to be very intentional about not letting my triggers, traumas, and biases interfere with my work. And that's something that if we truly want to help families where they are at, and we want to help them be their best selves, they are not us, right? They're not going through necessarily the same things we are. They don't always need the same things we need. We always have to have an open mind. Be aware of what can trigger your trauma. Anything can, right? Sounds, people, thoughts, smells. You walk up to a house and it smells a certain kind of way, or somebody has a certain fragrance or odor. Going to certain places. My foster parents passed away a couple years ago, and I just had to drive over by their house the other day. I had to stop and cry. Like I just needed a moment. Places can do this for us. Media, right? Hearing stories, reading, intakes that come in, having to read case files and what people are going through. Sometimes just your feelings can trigger, trauma. Just feeling a certain way about something can bring back a flood of other memories when you felt like that. And then finally, different situations. You might be in a situation with a family that is very similar to something you went through in your own home, and it can be easy to fall into that trauma. We have to intentionally work against this stuff. It's not easy. This is not easy work. Trauma-informed care is very kind and compassionate, and that sounds a little easy, right? Like being nice to people. It's hard, not necessarily being nice is hard, but being trauma-informed care, trauma-informed, having to think about how my trauma might leak into my work, having to intentionally fight against maybe my own biases when working with people so that I can see them and their scenario and not with my lens on it, right? um this is not easy stuff, and we just really have to be aware of that. Being trauma informed to me means being really thoughtful about my interactions. That's exactly what it is. It's making sure that when we deal with people, that I assume when I leave the house every morning that everybody I encounter today is having a hard day. I don't know what it is. Maybe a relative just passed away. Maybe, they just lost their job, or they just, their car just broke down. I am just going to assume that everybody's having a hard time. I don't give people passes, right? People can't be abusive to me if they're having a hard time. But, when my mom and dad passed away, right, at the end of 2020 and 2021, everybody was softer with me, right? They had understanding for me. They had understanding if I couldn't focus, or if I wasn't as patient, or if, I was a little irritable or on edge for a long time, like months, like almost a whole year. I'm just barely getting back to life, really. And that was the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021. And so we just want to go out into the world and assume everybody's dealing with hard stuff. Nobody, I don't imagine that any of my friends would have let me be rude or abusive to them, but they all gave me some softness and a little bit of a pass, right? To not be my best self in those moments. That's trauma informed. When I leave the house and go into the world, I also give other people that benefit as well. So I asked you so far to think about, right, dealing with trauma for our clients. And I've asked you to think about when you have trauma. Next, I'm going to ask you kind of a hard question, because this one is a little harder for us um, to look at. It's hard for us to embody this one. But we have to acknowledge that a lot of times the work that we do, especially if we're part of the child welfare system, if we are engaged in any part of the system that's doing removals, right, or having people do things that they don't necessarily agree with, sometimes, my friends, the hard reality is that our very presence is trauma. When I show up to somebody's house and decide, if I'm an investigator and I decide, I staff it with my supervisor, and I decide that a removal needs to happen, my very presence there is trauma. It's trauma for the kids. It's trauma for mom and dad. Even if we show up and it is a horrible situation and we look at it and we say, you know what, mom and dad, that's what they get, right? We should have known this day was coming. That's what they get. Trauma does not have a qualifier. It doesn't say, well, only if the people didn't deserve it is it trauma, right? The act of you showing up to interfere in somebody's life, even in a helpful way, that is trauma. So what do we do when we understand that maybe our very presence is the trauma, or our very presence is traumatic? What do we do? Because we still need to help. There still needs to be something that happens, but what do we do with that? First and foremost, I would challenge us to have a heightened awareness of this. Be very, very aware that when you are engaging with families that are experiencing the child welfare system, that most likely their interactions with us are adding to their trauma, even if it's helpful, even if, even when people come here to foster kinship, right? We are very helpful. We offer a ton of resources that help families. We offer respite care. We will help you get your child-only TANF set up. We will help you, with those SNAP applications, with your licensing application so you can get paid. But the reality is, the fact that people have to come here for help in the first place is a reminder of what their life circumstances are right now. And sometimes them having to come to our doors to ask for help is a further trauma on them. Two things can be true at the same time. Something can be helpful, right? Coming to foster kinship to get services, and it can simultaneously be traumatic. We have to be so aware of this when we're dealing with people. A lot of times we might assume, I'm here to help, you know. Some people even think that families should be like thankful when they show up, right? If you've worked in this field a long time, you might be kind of laughing with me because that's not usually what happens. But we don't necessarily go into these things with a perception of, I might be causing some trauma right now. We go in with the mindset, I want to help, right? I want to create safety. And so we just have to realize that both might be true at the same time. Constant and consistent validation and acknowledgement, right? When we are working with our families, we have to validate those feelings. If we don't, we become so far out of touch with the people that we're working with that it becomes almost impossible for them to build rapport and trust us to help them. You know, when my mom and dad passed away, I'll use that as the example because I've used that today. You know, if any of you guys or anybody in the world had come to me and been like, you know, I'm really sorry to hear about your mom and dad, but look at the bright side, right? You don't have to be their in-home healthcare worker anymore. And now you have freedom or whatever. We're not on the same page, right? I don't see those as benefits. I take care of my mom and dad every day. So when I go home, I might not be rude to you in the moment because I'm a professional who's got lots of years and experiencing, you know, in being tactful. And I've kind of worked on hiding my facial expressions. I'm not all the way there yet, but, you know, but when I get home and I'm talking to my safe people, I would be like, can you believe what somebody said to me today? They actually said it was like a good thing that my mom and dad died. And I will probably never build rapport with you after that, or it'll be very difficult because me and you will be so far out of touch. It's the same thing for our families. When we understand that our presence there is causing some chaos, trauma in the body, whatever, we need to acknowledge that. You know, I do understand that this might be real hard for you. I understand that even though I'm here to help, that doesn't really make my presence here any easier, right? The way that we frame things with our families, the way that we acknowledge the fact that, you know, this is hard stuff, you know, and that we ongoingly know that this is hard, that this can be adding to trauma, right? We understand that. We're going to build that rapport with our families that allows them to really trust us and be able to accept the help that we're offering. Next, I would encourage you to be genuine. You know, you don't have to lie to people. You don't have to agree with everything people are doing, right? If you've got a face that doesn't lie, like this one, you might not be able to do it anyway. And people can tell when we're not genuine. You know, I can say to somebody, you know, I can't really hear you when you're yelling at me. I'm not going to be able to engage with you until you're done, right? That's not saying I don't want to hear what you're saying. Doesn't say I'm not going to communicate with you, but I'm just being real genuine with you. That communication style is not effective with me. It's not going to work. Right. If I'm honest and upfront with people like that, even when I'm telling them something that's not great or not, you know, it's a change or, you know, a criticism, not even a criticism, but constructive criticism, whatever, right? If I'm genuine, people are much more likely to buy into what I'm saying. People can tell when we're not genuine, and it is a huge, huge turnoff. You know, you guys can probably tell when people are not being genuine with you, you know, and how does that make you feel? You'd be like, all right, all right, thank you. You know, if you're nice people, you're probably like, okay, thank you. And then you're like, all right, well, I know that was fake, you know? So just make sure that you're being genuine. Genuine does not always mean that you have to be rainbows and glitters and unicorns about stuff. You can be like, hey, you know, this behavior is hard for me to understand why you would do that. But I also know that I don't understand everything, right? Maybe you can help me understand. I want to understand. You know, we can be genuine with people. It builds trust. Absolutely. You know, when we're real with people, they might know, they will realize that they might not always get the nicest or the best information from us, but they're going to get true information from us. And that's really important. Build successful partnerships through a trauma-informed lens. You know, throughout today, I've been talking about it's not just families or it's everybody, right? So build relationships with the other players that are going to be interacting with the family. Show yourself as like that you're going to work with these people anyway, right? And so you can set the stage for how people are going to interact with each other. As soon as you step onto the scene of something, you have an opportunity to be the example, right? I tell my kids this all the time. You can always be the example. We can work on building successful relationships and partnerships with, bio parents, with caregivers, with the children, right? With other people that we might be making referrals to. You might have cap attorneys or like attorneys that you're working with. Work with all of them through that trauma informed lens. I promise it will differentiate you in the case. Your character will begin to speak for itself and people will be drawn to that. A lot of times, parents, kids, people tell me, like, I don't even know why I like you. Okay, that's cool. You don't have to know why you like me, but you do, right? So what this brings up for me is the different myths I hear about kinship caregivers or families. How can we be more trauma informed to help me and have other professionals understand the hardships of being a kinship caregiver? So being trauma informed is really putting ourselves in other people's shoes, right? And even if we can't imagine, if we weren't raised in a household where we had to go live with grandma and grandpa or an aunt or an uncle, right? We can be real with ourselves. And if we know what our own trauma is, we don't necessarily have to be able to empathize with that exact circumstance, but we can empathize with the deep uncomfortableness that comes with that, right? That's where being trauma informed comes in. The other day, I know somebody that had a traumatic brain injury, right? And they were trying to explain to me how they're scared, right? Sometimes they worry if they're gonna like reharm themselves. They don't feel like they can focus. They were telling me all this stuff. And they were like, but you don't get it. Nobody gets it. And I had to be real honest. No, I don't get that because I've never had a traumatic brain injury. But I do know what it's like to feel anxious that I might hurt myself, right? I've had my gallbladder removed. I've had stuff happen there. I know what it's like to not be able to focus, right? I've been pregnant before and then I had COVID brain after I caught COVID for a while, so I don't necessarily know your exact scenario, but I can, by being trauma informed, I can find pathways to other experiences that I have had that might have left me feeling similar to you. And so throughout today, we actually have a session this afternoon where we are going to talk about a lot of the like tangible hardships that kinship families face. We're going to go in depth about that. But the way that we can incorporate our trauma informed work is by understanding our own trauma so that when we need to relate to people, even if we don't know exactly what they're going through, we can find relatable events in our own history that allows us to imagine what they may be feeling or going through and find that compassion for them. Build trust and rapport, right? Again, we don't want to be, oh, sorry, you guys, I clicked the wrong button. We don't want to be the negative Nancy boss, right? We don't want to be that. We want to be people that parents, caregivers, other people we're working with, that they feel comfortable communicating with, that they feel comfortable being vulnerable with, right? We're asking families to tell us what they need. That requires you to be real honest with yourself, So we've got to build trust and rapport with our families to make sure that they trust us enough to allow us to help them. Be transparent when possible. I know that we work in confidential cases and this isn't always possible, but as much as we can, we want to make sure that we want to make sure that we're being transparent. People can tell when we're not. People can tell when we're sugarcoating or leaving things out. And you can even be transparent about that too, right? Look, I can't tell you everything. I might not even be able to tell you as much as I want, but this is what I can share with you. The more just human to human we are with people and transparent we can be with them, the more that we're going to be able to build that rapport and that connection with them that allows us to truly help them, which is the goal, right? When we have kinship care or the child welfare system, period, right? It's to help families so that they can reunify and be stronger. Acknowledge and validate emotions. Told you guys we need to do this for ourselves, right? This is like the third time this has come up. This is important. That's why it keeps coming up. Let people know that you value the conversations you're having with them. Give verbal cues, when you're talking. Display active listening. Mirror their energy level about things. Ask clarifying questions or repeat their words back to them, right? These are all ways that we can show people that we are also engaged. These are ways that we can acknowledge the things that they're saying, normalize their reaction, acknowledge their history, right? These things that we're seeing up on the screen, these are great ways that we can let people know, you're not crazy. Your feelings are valid. There are some families, parents in the world that are just not good, right? They want to harm children, they want to cause harm, but that is a very, very, very small percentage. That's not the majority of people. The majority of people, if they could wave a magic wand, they would be good parents. Even if they were still partying or whatever they're doing that's not safe now, right? Even if they're in their own minds, they're like, I would like to be a functional drug user. They still want to be a good parent. So we need to acknowledge and validate people's emotions so that we can build that trust and rapport with them and start bringing them where we need them to be safe and appropriate for reunification and for their families. Be intentional about giving each family a clean slate. It is very easy. We all do it. This is human nature. So again, this is one of those things. Don't feel guilty about it. Just acknowledge it so that we can we can work on it, right? And we can be aware of it. Be intentional about giving a clean slate to every scenario you go into. It's very easy to assume that because this looks very similar to this, right? Two cases, one looks very similar to the other, that the same things are going on. But maybe not. Maybe, in one household, we're seeing neglect because mom has to work two jobs. She's got to support the kids and she's got to work two jobs. So we end up with kind of like involuntary neglect, right? And then in another one, we've got mom and dad partying all the time. So that's neglect. But when we read the case, maybe we just hear in both cases, mom and dad are never home and the children are left to themselves. It's very easy for us to make assumptions about what that means and whatever. We have to be just as intentional about giving families a clean slate and being willing to evaluate each one separately and independently of one another, right? Doesn't mean that we don't use our expertise. It doesn't mean that we don't build off of what we've done before. But I don't necessarily say that X equals Y, right? I say that I have to investigate further. So please be very, very intentional about offering each family that clean slate opportunity for you to get to know them individually and for them to have the opportunity to work the plan that they need and not a plan that somebody else needed. So talking about a clean slate, that's going to lead us right into our next section because it's very easy for us to make assumptions about people, right? The assumptions that we make about people, it guides the way that we believe that they should work services, what outcomes. It's what leads us to identify challenges, right? We identify challenges based off of our own life experiences. So I want to take just a minute to talk about the assumptions that we make about people and how those may or may not be accurate. So when we think about, parenting or we think about child welfare, the families that we work with, there are several assumptions that we may make, especially about parents. A lot of time we assume that parents know how to care for their children's physical and medical needs. Babies don't come with a book, right? And not everybody has access to parenting classes. And for some people, their last doctor's appointment might have been the one that their own mom and dad made for them before they left home, right? They might not even know how to make appointments on their own. So they may not understand the importance of or physically how to care for those medical needs, especially if they're not caring for their own, right? And it's very embarrassing. We talked earlier about people might come across as uncooperative, but it's really very embarrassing to have to say, I don't know how to provide basic childcare, right? It's much easier to say, forget this. You guys are crazy. I didn't do anything wrong. Everybody's fine. Nobody's sick, right? It's easier to say that stuff and have that defensive wall up. We assume that people know how to protect their children from harm or injuries inflicted by others. Again, a lot of people are out in the world getting hurt. Um, Oh, I see a note here that says calparents.org offers parenting classes on Zoom for free. So great resource, you guys. So another assumption that we make about families is that they know how to protect their children from harm. There's a lot of people themselves getting hurt out in the world, people getting taken advantage of by others, or being harmed by others, or being hurt by others, people with low self-esteem, right? That don't know how to value themselves. If people don't know how to protect themselves from harm or injury, they may not know how to do this for their children either. And again, it's easier to put up that defensive wall than it is to say, than it is to just acknowledge that you don't know what to do here. That can be very embarrassing, especially when you look around and it looks like on the surface, everybody else has it figured out but you. We assume that people know how to play with their children. I'll be real honest with you. Growing up in foster care, sometimes I feel like I just appeared at like age 14, 15 sometimes. I don't really feel like I had much of a childhood. When I started having kiddos myself, playing was not in my repertoire. I have friends, thankfully, that are very goofy that will help me figure that out. I'm now much a more laid back person, thankfully. But when I first started having kids, look, I didn't know nothing about playing with children. And if you have families that, maybe people have been partying since, they were 12, 13, 14, middle school, high school, when's the last time their weekend involved something that was playing with kids? They might not physically know how to do this. We assume that people know how to talk politely with their children and that they know verbal abuse is related to stress. Not everybody knows this. I was telling you guys earlier about how my pawpaw, he came from Vietnam, right? One of his favorite sayings was that sticks and stones comment, and then put your big girl pants on, right? You're all right, put your big girl pants on. We don't always understand that verbal abuse can be impacting. And a lot of our families don't realize this or recognize this. This is something that we have to teach, and we have to continue to teach it with our actions, our examples, consistently and over time, because this is a new principle for a lot of people. We assume that people know how to enjoy the company of children. Again, if you have not spent the last, 10, any time, hanging out with kids, if your weekends are not kid friendly, you might not know how to enjoy the company of children. You might not know, if you don't even do anything that's child friendly, where are you going to bring a child into that? We might need to teach people how to do that. We might need to teach them what's appropriate. I got kids. If you ask me my favorite Saturday afternoon, no kids, right? There's no kids involved. It's like relaxing by myself, getting a massage somewhere, maybe, right? Being on the beach, I don't know, right? And so we might not know how to enjoy the company of children. We said sticks and stones can break my bones, but words hurt forever. Yeah, and we might not know that. Families might not realize that. We assume that people know how to have a good time in the absence of drugs, alcohol, danger, violence, or sex. Again, if that's not what you've been doing, if all of your adrenaline comes from these these things, right, partying, things like that, you might not even know how to have a good time outside of this. Do you know of any resources that we can bring up to support families that are struggling to make connections with their children or kinship child? I'm hoping that throughout the day we do have we have a workshop all on resources. We'll talk about that a little bit there, because there is a huge need for that. So we will touch on that today, absolutely. And if we do that session and we don't answer your question, please make sure to bring that back up, and we will make sure to cover that more in depth. We sometimes assume that people understand what their children are going through emotionally when they're placed in care, right? They might feel like the kids are better off, right? They're better off where they are. They take better care of them anyway. The kids don't even miss me. They're probably glad I'm gone. People don't necessarily realize how heartbroken their own kids are. And so this can be hard for them. We assume a lot of times that people know how to separate their shame, humiliation, and frustration. I keep telling you guys that these are embarrassing situations, right? Not everybody knows how to differentiate between the two. Sometimes it's just embarrassing. And we think that people should suck it up, and participate anyway, but they might not always have the ability, at least not in the beginning. And they might, the people that we place the kids with are probably the people that were their biggest supporters up until now. So in whatever capacity. So they've probably got a lot of humiliation happening. We assume that people can read to their children. We know reading is fundamental. Some people can't read for themselves, and reading, we know that can really impact the bond that parents have between children. It can impact educational outcomes. So this might be a real challenge that families face. And then finally, we may assume that families or parents can read and understand court reports, contracts, or how to prioritize their case plans. I've been doing this pretty much my whole life. I'm not going to tell y'all how old I am. I usually tell my classes I don't feel like it today, but I'm not a spring duck anymore, or spring chicken, whatever the phrase is. I've been doing this for a long time. And sometimes these court reports are still confusing to me. Sometimes I still have to be like, hey, does this say what I think it says? Sometimes it's even hard for us as professionals. So we have to imagine somebody that might not have great, time management skills, stress management skills, doesn't understand the lingo, right? How difficult must that be for them? And we've already taken their kids, right? In most cases, we've already removed the child, or we're already engaging in some pretty significant safety planning and things like that. This is a very touchy subject. We raise people in the world to believe that, we tell children, your parents are kind of the end all be all. At my house, I'm the final say. Imagine how humiliating and embarrassing it is to have the state come in and be like, nope, you're not the final say. We're the final say. Service plans and court reports can be overwhelming just in their wording and volume. Yeah, these aren't easy things. And sometimes, again, it is much easier to say, forget this is stupid. I don't want to participate. It's you guys, it's not me, than it is to really have to be vulnerable and say, I've got no clue what to do, right? You probably already think, if you're a parent, that people don't think you're a good parent. You're already feeling judged. You've already had somebody tell you what you're doing isn't keeping your child safe enough to even keep them at home. You have to create a very safe space full of trust and rapport to get people past that embarrassment, to be real with you so that you can help them, right? And we can, whether we think that parents are worthy or they're deserving of us taking this kind of consideration, I'll tell you right now, it's not always for the parents, right? We're trying to do what's best for children. Helping parents and understanding this for parents is what's best for their children. So even when sometimes we don't think mom and dad maybe deserve all of this from us, we have to remember that, we don't know what, everybody's worthy of kindness, compassion, understanding, support, all of those things. And for two, at the end of the day, this isn't about even mom and dad at the end of things. It's about the child. And it's about trying to do every single thing possible to help that child reunify or build those strong, healthy, supportive connections if reunification isn't possible. Don't ignore the statistics, right? Don't pretend that the system's perfect. Don't pretend that people are perfect. We don't have to sit around and engage in complaint sessions and, talk down on our coworkers and everything. We don't have to go that far, but we don't have to pretend things are perfect either. You don't have to pretend that you're not overwhelmed. You don't have to pretend that you don't have high caseloads. You don't have to pretend that things are always easy for you. You don't have to pretend that the system is perfect. And actually, when you do that, you turn people off more than you engage with them. So don't ignore it. It doesn't change things. It doesn't change that we have work to do. It doesn't change that things need to happen here. But yeah, the system isn't always perfect. Don't take it personal. When people are talking about the system, you're not the system, and you have the opportunity as the representative standing there at that time to change the mindset. They're probably not even talking about you, but as humans, you're talking about my job, talking about my people, you talk about, the work that I do. Try to separate the two. This will help you build a lot of rapport with people. Encourage and support respectful advocacy. Sometimes people aren't doing the right thing. Maybe there's a caseworker that's really not engaging properly, or a therapist, or maybe somebody's not getting what they need. When people need to advocate for themselves, encourage and support that. We don't have to be cheerleaders for improper behavior just because it's coming from the system, which is intending to help, right? We can encourage people that if they're not getting what they need, that they can respectfully advocate for what they're needing. They don't have to, if the caseworker isn't doing what they need, it's not like a ding on you if they need to advocate somewhere else. And we need to encourage and support that when it's necessary. If we encourage and support it when it's necessary, families are more likely to listen to us when we say, well, maybe that's not where people are coming from right now, right? Maybe sometimes it's not necessary because people don't understand the process or whatever. So if we encourage respectful advocacy when it is necessary and appropriate, people will listen to us also when we give guidance that maybe that's not what we need right now, right? We build that trust and rapport. Last and not least, but not least, this is my last slide of the day. Just remember, that the vast majority of people, they love their children. They're not intentionally putting them at risk. Even if they're doing things, obviously people know if they're going out and using, right? But we don't know where that's coming from. For some people, that is their trauma response, right? Not engaging in their responsibilities is a trauma response. Do we still need them to engage in their responsibilities and create safe environments? Absolutely. Do we need to demonize them in the process and act like their lack of ability to make good decisions right now equates to them not being good people? Absolutely not. Right. And we can do that in a way, and well, I'll say when we do that, we will build trust, rapport, and we will be able to engage with people a lot better. We are all just people making the best choices that we know how, based on what we know about the world, our coping mechanisms, and our life experiences. Right. What I know, you might not know, and what I might not know. So when we can engage with each other in these trauma-informed ways, giving each other and ourselves that kindness, compassion, and mercy, we are going to maximize our potential for success across the board. So that's what I got, you guys. Boom, we've made it through our presentation today. That is trauma-informed care for professionals. We've got about 4 minutes left, which I purposely wanted to leave for us because I wanted to give an opportunity to answer any questions, comments, anything like that. And just kind of give us a moment to process that, because I know we'll be in our next session very shortly. So does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? I don't know. Any takeaways from what we've talked about today? Huh? I have a Q&A. I don't have a Q&A slide.
No, in the
Oh, in the thing. You want me to read this? Okay, so it made me blush a little bit. That's why I didn't want to read it, but Audrey's gonna make me read it. So there's comments in the Q&A section that says, I've seen a bazillion trauma presentations and discussions, and sometimes they can be so boring, especially when you've heard the same info again. You're doing a really great job, very engaging and personal. You're loving it. Thank you so much. I am really passionate about this stuff, and I hope that the information that we've shared today really sets the tone for the rest of the things we're going to talk about in regards to kinship care. So thank you guys. I hope it was able to kind of help us wake up if you're on the West Coast. And then if you're on the East Coast, I hope, we got you not too far into like lunch and feeling the itis, all of that stuff. So thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for sharing your story. I can relate because of my personal history. And thank you too, right? Especially those of us that have this specific history. This is hard stuff. So thank you guys all for being here. Thank you for being willing to take on that secondary trauma, right? And for doing the really hard work to make sure that we are helping families in the most effective way possible. I'm going to go ahead. So the way that we will transition from one slide section to the other is I'll go ahead and shut the video off. We'll take a few moments and here in just a few minutes, 10:30, you guys, is that when? No, we have a break, right?
10:45.
Okay, so if you guys want to, mute yourselves or take a break, we will come back at 10:45. And that is when our next session will start. Should I be mentioning anything else before we head out? Nope, we're perfect, you guys. So thank you for joining me. Feel free to take that break and we'll see you back here at 10:45.